Good evening. My name is Catherine Spencer-Ross, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa. Welcome to the first lecture of our 2024-2025 season. This is also our first hybrid presentation, so please bear with us if things go awry. We don't know this new format. I expect you're looking forward to this evening's presentation as much as I am. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Buras and his wife, Luann, who just stepped out for a moment, to Ottawa and to this Heritage Ottawa event. My appetite for tonight's event was fully whetted yesterday when I had the honor of dining with Dr. Buras and Luann. While we had lovely general conversation, we certainly strayed into discussions of architecture, writings of architecture, architects, and even a beauty scale. However, in response to specific questions from fellow dinner guests, Dr. Buras coyly responded with, "I have a slide on that." So we'll get to those slides very soon. Before we do, however, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the development of the National Capital Region as we now know it. For hundreds of years, Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their indigenous rights to be recognized and respected, and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our lecture sponsors. Sandy Smallwood of Andrix Holdings is a longtime generous and faithful sponsor of Heritage Ottawa, and I see he's in the audience tonight, so nice to see you, Sandy. We are also thankful for the operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. Tonight, I'm particularly grateful for wonderful support from the National Capital Commission, which has allowed us to present this event in person and simultaneously online, and indeed to be able to host Dr. Buras. We also have Heritage Ottawa members and donors in the room and online. Thank you so much for your support. It is your contributions that allow us to have a real and measurable impact on heritage conservation in Ottawa through education and programming such as this free lecture. And we rely on your support for our advocacy work, particularly costly campaigns such as the addition to the Chateau Laurier. Thank you for your ongoing support. For those of you who are not yet members, if you have not already done so, I invite you to visit our table at the back of the room or check us out on our website at heritageottawa.org. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening. Dr. Nir Buras is a leading new traditional architect and urbanist, founder of the Classic Planning Institute and author of The Art of Classic Planning. There are some copies available of his book for sale at the back of the room. Dr. Buras designs towns, cities, and buildings. He runs experiments, holds workshops, writes, and speaks about some of the most interesting developments in the world of architecture and planning, and where we might find ourselves in the future. His work helps communities with their long-term planning and architects who are inventing new local styles. He teaches Classic Planning Institute Fellows architectural literacy and classic planning basics, and researches the neuroscience of the built environment with his scientific colleagues. Alain Miguelez is the Vice President of Capital Planning and Chief Planner of the National Capital Commission. He oversees 4 divisions: long-range planning, transportation planning, federal approvals, heritage and archaeology, and sustainable development and environmental services functions. That'd be an awfully big business card. Prior to the NCC, he worked for almost 20 years with the City of Ottawa in several capacities within the planning department, most recently as manager of planning policy, where he led his team to the preparations of the city's 2021 official plan. He is the author of 2 books, Transforming Ottawa, Canada's Capital in the Eyes of Jacques Grabert, and A Theatre Near You, 150 Years of Going to the Show in Ottawa-Gatineau. After our presenters have finished speaking, they will take questions both from the floor and from our online audience. Those online can submit their questions via the chat function. And with that, Dr. Buras, the floor is yours.
Good evening. My name is Nir Buras. I'm here as a guest of Alain and of Catherine. Thank you so much for the lovely hosting and the opportunity to share some of the stuff we've really discovered in the last years, relatively short period of time. Got to get rid of that. I want to say thank you, a deep and great thank you to DevCore, Daniel Landry, and to Jack Pine, Liam Mooney, for their help in bringing us here, and also for the support for the masterclass tomorrow. And by the way, the masterclass has AIA credits affiliated with it. So we're going to be discussing today beauty and authenticity and Ottawa architecture, really in the context, originally it was in the context of additions to buildings, but really it's almost as much about a path forward for the city of Ottawa, or a city like Ottawa, which has so much going for it. So I'm going to speak briefly about how we got here, about classic planning, about some examples of new traditional architecture, common sense, and then maybe some food for thought. So the first thing is how we got here. Well, it used to be until about 1750 that all architecture was predicated on creating a pleasing experience. And then people asked, well, what's the opposite of pleasure? Pain. Can we have a pain-based architecture? And the answer was yes. Now think any tall building. It would be immensely large. It would have a simple geometry, infinitely repeated, and no ornament. That is the architecture of pain as foreseen in 1750. Along with that bifurcation, that was the fork in the road that led to everything we see today. Along with that came a fantastic series, mostly in the 19th century, of experiments. These were all romantic experiments. 1750 was sort of the end of the Enlightenment. The Romantic era started by 1800. It was full bore. And to be perfectly honest, we're in a Romantic era. The first 100 years were backward looking, neo-medieval, neoclassical, neo-everything you can think of. And the last 100 or 150 years have been an equally non-existent futures that we're supposedly trying to make, industrialize, mechanize, all that kind of good stuff. So the conceptual, when I was researching all this stuff in my PhD, this is sort of my story. I went to find out why stuff looked the way it did, because it wasn't making sense what I was being taught in architecture school that we ought to design or design like. And I asked, where did all these ideas come from? And it turns out that they were romantic, as I've been telling you, but also when you listen to your teachers talking about stuff that is conceptual and bears no relationship whatsoever to what something's going to look like. And then there's important stuff like rationalism and structural stuff and light and space that informs the design, but still doesn't tell you what something's going to look like. And then there are styles. And why can't we just talk about styles per se? Now, we actually can. I'm not going to get into the proof of all that kind of stuff, but the mix of topics and genre of topic that was in the discourse was so confusing that it actually made what we were studying kind of senseless. Until World War I, there were 100 years of the most fantastic architectural explorations that combined both the sublime and the beautiful, taking these ideas that I just had there. That was the slide that was mentioned earlier. taking them sort of to their own extremes. And then the war came. And I don't think we've gotten out of that trauma. The trauma of industrialized warfare doesn't seem to go away. Civil War in the US, which was the first industrialized war, is still not over. And then after World War II, everybody came home with with PTSD. So you had this business of building a bunker in the woods as if it was the normal and right thing to do. And it was for somebody like Gropius, who was deeply affected by the war. I refer you to Anne Sussman. She is the master of this line of thinking. But really what was going on was the exploration of fear-based design. The greatest, the sublime, the fear-based, the pain-based kind of design that was defined in the 1750s. Piranesi drew it and Libeskind built it, along with, by the way, remember this little yellow thing making dystopia, post-World War II. You have blank buildings, no faces, no nothing, no windows. Where are the windows? I mean, no people. What about the people? So this was a situation. The previous slide has that little yellow thing that's Making Dystopia by James Stevens Curl. He tells you a blow-by-blow description of how modernism came to rule the architecture world. I discovered this back in the 90s on my own. He wrote the book. I didn't care to get into it. What I did observe was that after World War I, when we did have, like, for example, here in Ottawa, where there was a growth of dramatic growth in population, the actual ground coverage of urban fabric was not 3 times or 5 times. The population grew by 3, 5 times, 7 times, whatever it was. The ground cover was much, much larger, what we call sprawl today. And in Ottawa, it kind of looks like this. You know the area very well. This is Ottawa in 1915 versus Ottawa in today from Google Maps. Thank you very much. And we will be working on this in the masterclass, learning sort of how to read it. And when you read it, you kind of can tell that I'm coming as a stranger to this wonderful place. And I see all this green stuff, and it's clearly agriculture, and it seems to be very fecund. It seems to be really well, the agriculture seems to reign beautifully around here. You still have some forests left over here and there, which is telling me that the agriculture really is great around here. And then you have these white areas, and they seem to be haphazard. There doesn't seem to be a good reason for any of them specifically. And you start looking at their edges and you realize it was the first opportunity for some farmer to sell his land to do good by his family. So we're going to take a look at what happens in there in the fabric, but really what's happening in general. And this is what I discovered while I was doing my PhD on modernist architecture that was actually romantic. I asked the question, well, what came before? And I discovered the classical method. It's how people built for beauty and for people and for well-being and for durability and for adaptive reuse almost without limit. So the ideas shown in that slide with all those notions, you had the idea of evolutionary progress, which led to ideas like architecture of our time, that geniuses would lead an avant-garde. There were no geniuses before 1800. It was simply an idea that people didn't use. The whole idea that technology represents progress. I mean, there's an idea of progress, but you know that there's no progress in history. There's progression, but no progress really. the idea of the functionalist position where form supposedly is supposed to follow function, but they never tell you if function means that you can do something in a space, that it actually performs as a building or has a utilitarian appearance. So you're always floating between definitions and nobody gives you advanced warning of what they're going to say. You're stuck in jargon that is impenetrable and not that, meaningful at the end. And then the idea that there are only modernist styles which adequately represent us as Homo sapiens on the planet, it doesn't really compute. So the what came before, there are three terms here. They all sound similar and we do not conflate them. Classical is the name of a style of era, capitalized, it's a name. Lowercase, it's a method. And that's a method that has been used around the world for the last 5,000 years by every single culture that ever built anything. And classic is like the best of its sort. Classic car, classic Coke. And the only thing that classic planning is really just a compendium of what has worked. And we have thousands of years of experience so that we know exactly what can work, how it works, why it would be a good idea to use this versus that, and so on. We're not experimenting on people with an idea of meeting some notions that really are not very easy to explain. So the values unique to all this, first of all, if you stand in the middle of a street like here, what you see most of is buildings. So the most important thing in urbanism is the architecture. It's the buildings. That's what you experience. You don't experience the asphalt that much. You really want to not. You might experience trees where you have them, but it's the buildings. They say in politics, it's the buildings. The idea that it's a genuinely holistic method. I'm not going to get into the proof of that. We'll talk about it tomorrow in the master class, but it's based on the idea of firmness, commodity, and delight. Who here has heard of Vitruvius? Okay, so this is you know what I'm talking about. And the beautiful thing about Vitruvius, I mean, the guy was, he was an engineer. He didn't know from much, but he knew everything there was to know, practically speaking, pretty much. His urban stuff is without compare. Ottawa was laid out on a Vitruvian plan, FYI. But his idea of firmness, commodity, delight is actually a translation into the world of construction of the unity of truth, goodness, and beauty, which is the most profound and fundamental Western philosophical idea. It underpins all of Western philosophy. Then we have something that was completely forgotten. Who here has heard of a green zone? Green belt? They don't exist. I mean, you can't put your finger on it. It's an idea, it's an abstract notion, but you have countryside. And a classicist has town and country all day long. And they need to be in balance. You can't have town without country. Like Leon Creer says, wherever humans settle, there's going to be a brown spot. We know that much, but we do need that green around it that sustains us and separates us into viable communities. And what we discovered most recently, I'd say in the last year, and this is really striking, we're kind of the leaders in neuroaesthetics, neuroscience, urban neuroscience. We're in the process of writing a book, it'll come out next year, called Neuroaesthetic City. And one of the things we discovered was half of the brain is devoted to hands. So if we don't use our hands, we become stupid. And we have. Apparently, for individuals, for society, and for the planet itself, we need to start construction manually again, complete with all the ornaments and everything else, to get a genuinely healthy community going. So what is the place of modernist expression? I think you need to decide that. I think you're here in a community and you have some of, I'd say, the best examples of modernist buildings that have been built, or good examples of them that have been built in the last 50 years. Some of them actually have some interest and value, but 44% of all energy and emissions come from buildings, and 90% of those buildings are modernist. So is it possible? And oh, I forgot about urban sprawl. Add to that 15% people running away from downtown. That's intolerable. So is it possible that a style dictum causes global warming, or is a major cause of global warming? That's inconceivable. But those are the numbers. I don't know what to make of them. So all we do know is that that the modernist idiom permeates the whole world today. There's no place without it. Most places are not as well developed, let's say, at least as central Ottawa. And this was the initial response to modernist stuff. Pruitt-Igoe, by the way, by the same architect, I believe, who built the World Trade Center, whatever. But what really makes the modern aesthetic not work is low fractality. Who here has ever heard of fractals? Okay, you're an unusual crowd. It's a beautiful algorithm. And trees are fractal. Everything in nature, most things in nature are fractal, or their appearance is fractal. Let's say water is not fractal, but the appearance of water, like waves and stuff, is fractal. Clouds are fractal. Trees have 3 fractals to them. That's why we think they're beautiful. Single fractals are not pretty, but trees have 3: the leaves, the bark, and the branches. So that's 3. And you need a minimum, apparently. Again, we're leading this kind of conversation because even my colleagues, we have a fractal round table at the Classic Planning Laboratory where we discuss these things. We sequence what happens in your brain when you walk down the street down to the 10 milliseconds. We know what happens. So you got 3 fractals going on in there. But the way art imitates nature, this is the nature of our emergence, which is multifractal environment, where you have the clouds, the mountains, the rocks, the trees, the hills, the shadow of the clouds, all that. Everyone is a different set of fractals. And the way it works in architecture is we use architecture that is multiple fractal. And the classical method, all the architectures of all the world provide that. So all of them are going to give you something. It's basically brain food. You don't get it, you can't get it with other aesthetics. So basically what happens is, and I'm going to dive a little bit, but come right back out. The proportional systems, there are 8 proportional systems occurring in traditional architecture, not one. Everybody's heard of golden section, the golden proportion. You have 8, in fact, and they're all derivative of that one way or another. But primarily, you see the sort of the turquoisey color. That's a differentiation proportion, and that is golden section. It differentiates large from small. But then you have a punctuation proportion. That's the blue, and you can see how it occurs at different scales and different parts of the design. This is Palladio's Doric order. And it happens in every traditional design again and again and again at so many levels that is the fractal that the brain processes and doesn't know. When you're looking at a classical building, your brain doesn't know you're not looking at a tree. And it lights up the beauty center. There's a beauty center. It's the pleasure center in the brain. It's right here where the third eye is supposed to be. And it lights up when you see something pretty. And it doesn't light up when you see something ugly or scary at all. It won't. That gives us the permission to design whole cities based on this neuro-aesthetic value to create environments, really good environments for people that would require folks enjoying building them by hand. And then, of course, there's the part of your brain. That's a neuroscience again. It's hard for me to not think about it because it seems to work, at least in explaining why certain things work. The same way that when you're watching somebody kick a goal in soccer, you're tilting your body together with them. Same thing happens. Your hands twitch when you're looking at a brick wall, trying to figure out how the bricks got there. It's an amazing thing, our mind, body, all that. So, and we check all this with eye tracking. So you can see in the design below, it's a modernist design. It's Frank Gehry's memorial for Eisenhower in DC. Eyes going everywhere. And it's landing in places that have absolutely no consequence for the design. Completely accidental. When you're doing a traditional design, whammo, eye goes exactly to where you personally, having built that, are going to put the inscription and the carving. How does that happen? This is what a holistic system does. So, still trying to say, so what do we do with this modern stuff? Anybody know this building? Who here thinks it's pretty? Okay. Okay. Let's do a neuroscience experiment. Without thinking, what's on a scale of 1 to 10? And what I want you to do is shoot up your hands without thinking and looking around. What number between 1 to 10 comes to mind when you look at that? First number that came to mind. First number. Okay. All right. As long as you're not thinking about it, you're spot on. It's the gut feeling, that reaction. It's a pre-attentive response. And that's the response we're interested in. The intellection that comes after that, that's the blah blah of the little guy explaining to you why some building has value, and who cares? It's really about your experience. When you're looking at these other buildings, what the hell are you supposed to do with them? They actually do not register in the brain as buildings. They register as structures. And because there's no hierarchy in anything in there, and there's no fractality to them whatsoever, your brain is actually confounded, and that is stressful. It stresses the brain out. It's trying to figure out what the hell is that, let alone where the front door is. But I don't like to criticize stuff that is bad and ugly just for the sake of criticizing it for being bad and ugly. I don't think that's good enough. I really like to come with a slightly nicer approach to things. So I kind of look at these guys as simply they're incomplete. They could use a real roof, and they could use real facades. And we actually did our first one of these back in the 2008 or 9. It was for His Majesty's birthday at the time. I think it was his 60th birthday or something. So it's a British embassy in DC. You can see a little bit of it in the left middle. It's this sort of an egg crate design. And let's see here. It's an egg crate design, very similar to we passed by that building yesterday, egg crate building, the British something or other on Lord Elgin. It looks like a building around here. I think it's the same guy. On the one side of it, you've got the Chancery by Edwin Lutyens. It's a delicious little item. And on the other side, you have this sort of pavilion that's going on. So this was back in 2008 or 9. We drew this up. It's got a roof now. And if you give me 1 foot in front of that building, I can get a real facade happening on it. And it so happens that I'm telling you, the system is holistic. So from a security standpoint, this building is 80% more secure than the previous one with all that glass and thin walls. Not only that, but because it has that layer of stone on the outside and a cavity, That's exactly how you fend off the bad effects of anti-tank missile charges. Anyways, so you get a building that ties all these elements together. It looks somewhat, I don't know, maybe Georgian or something. So we have new traditional architecture going around in the world today. I invite you all to the Beauty and Ugliness in Architecture Conference in Oslo, May 2, 3, 4, something like that, next year. You will feel right at home, and you will be the most hopeful individuals coming back to Canada, because you'll know that there are folks actually interested in making places good looking and in the most genuine way. A good place to find examples of this is in the Classic Planning Herald. We have a quarterly magazine. But you have all these wonderful architects around the world. This is Paczki in Berlin. The whole thing of reconstructing Dresden, Warsaw, Frankfurt, architects hate it, and the people love it. It's a process that's been going on. You've got David Schwartz working in DC. You have Andrei Nikiforov. Look at how precious his detailing is. I mean, this guy's really trying to, make a mark. Stefan Lippert, Val d'Europe in Paris, just outside Paris. It's a Disney development, and it has been developed by Bernard, hyphenated last name, who actually created a process by which you could genuinely develop neighborhoods with new traditional architecture. All these were built in the last 10 years or so, 15 maybe. New parking garages. The one on the right is in Staunton, Virginia. The one on the left is a design we produced for Zionsville, Indiana. These guys in the Netherlands, our studio did a dorm building recently. We can't tell you who it's for or what, but there it is. And a waterfront development. Actually, the building here on the right is that same dorm building before we designed the dorm building. But ladies and gentlemen, this is a kind of a future that I propose to you as something we could live with and enjoy. And it's something that this town could very naturally have for itself. And there is some good work happening here by some people who really cared to create something more pleasing. So it's a common sense thing to do. I don't see the option. Want more glass? Okay. Enjoy it. On the urban level, we recently did a few miles of streets in Indianapolis, just not that far from here. I think it's and of course, we did all the analyses, all the urban analyses like everybody else, but we took the styles of Indianapolis, that mix of styles that makes Indianapolis unique, that boom, I've landed and I'm in Indianapolis. And we developed, I don't know how many buildings we drew from those, 100 maybe. And then we placed them on the map. There's a model, a 3D model of the whole street with all the new buildings. And you can see that this is a place that you could call home, a place that you could remember. And this is another part of the neuroscience. I'm sorry, it really just chases me everywhere. The whole business of memory, human memory, actually all mammalian memory, maybe even reptilian. I don't know. I never asked a snake. Memory is locational. All memory is locational. Try it out now. Think of anything in your memory. And I guarantee the first thing that's going to come to mind is where it happened. Okay, this is how we work. This is what we are as people. So what's the point? Place making is memory making. We owe it to the future generations to create places that they can have their memories there. What's the point of not if we're building already? So as we're growing while staying the same, if we have qualities we want to maintain, we might be building new things that look like this. Or in other environments, stuff that looks like this, so a little town square that we put together. By the way, we copy, we steal, we imitate, we emulate, because how are you going to do really, really good music unless you can do that and then make your own thing out of it? So we're into the first thing I tell my people in the studio, okay, you like this building? Copy it. And then we'll start working on it because we need to adjust it to the new place. We need to invent it for the new place. What's invention? It's taking technology from this context and putting it in that context. That design is a technology. We're putting it in a new place. We're inventing all day long. And we're leveraging authenticity and beauty to build and mature urban fabric. I can go on for a bit, but I think that might not necessarily be the best thing right now. Have you guys had enough? You get the concept, right? All right. So I will just jump to the end. And I'll just tell you in a few slides about ourselves. This is the food for thought. So these are the thoughts. I think that there is a real good question how to integrate indigenous style in Western construction at scale. What was built on the US Mall to represent the Native Americans in the United States, I don't think is a building that adequately expresses their cultures or what they went through. The question is, how do we actually wield ornament and shape on the canvas that is the city? We happen to work in this medium. There are other architects who do, like you saw in the other slides. What is very, very important is the idea of architecture planning being problem-solving disciplines. It's over. Problem solving creates new problems. And there's a mathematical proof of that. It was presented by the California Department of Transportation some time ago. So you need something else. And that something else is aspirational. What do you love about Ottawa? What do you want more of? What do you want that you don't have now? And that's what we're going to ask tomorrow morning in the aspiration session. And that's going to be the basis for the masterclass. And there's the beauty scale thing. You can look at anything in the world and put it on a beauty scale because it's a holistic system. That beauty scale number that you all also tells you the durability of the building and its adaptive reuse long term. Because truth, goodness, and beauty, firmness, commodity, delight are unity. And that is the holistic model we're working with. So it could be that what we're doing really is a viable future. The Classic Planning Institute has a studio, an academy, a STOA, a library, a laboratory. We're doing a video project called Extreme City Makeover, the CP Herald you saw already. The studio itself and all the other organizations are around what we call our STOA. We have traditional architecture gatherings. They've been online so far. I think we're going to hold them live or hybrid in Oslo and London next year. The Neuroaesthetic City is coming out of the lab. We teach in the academy. Our first year programs, architectural literacy, classic planning, and 100-year plan studio. The work that the students do is beautiful and they really get a good kick out of it. Architectural literacy. This is what you actually need to know if you're ever going to really deal with a built environment. You just need these tools. It's like the scales of music. It's like understanding what chords are and so on. Second year program deals with more technical things. A lot of history goes into it. Classic planning basics and the 100-year plan studio. So this is an invitation for tomorrow's aspirational workshop and masterclass. You're going to get 5 HSWCUs. Get the book. What can I tell you? It says a lot more than I can say, and in such a short period of time, you might like it. It's got pictures, okay? And it's also very heavy, so you can dry flowers in it, prop a door open, or if you have some conflict with an animal. Anyways, join our community and spread the word, and questions come after. Is that correct? Okay, so I now leave the premises. Thank you. Thank you. Are you on my computer? No.
Good. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Buras. I can't tell you what an honor it is to share this podium with you and to be talking about this to this group tonight. I come at this from obviously the angle of an urban planner, but also from where I work, the National Capital Commission, and in a way, in a country like Canada or any other country, there is no better place than the nation's capital to talk about these things because of how important it is to get things like symbolism and aspiration and significance just right. We have a responsibility, perhaps more than any other city in a country, to talk about these things and get them right. So I want to spend a little bit of time at first dealing with, from a planning perspective, with what I call tackling the legacies of modernist planning, which is something that in our profession we sort of do, whether we realize it or not. And then once I cover that, I want to get into the architecture discussion because I came at this as well from initially when Catherine and I were talking about our topic tonight. We started to think about, well, how would we go about intervening in what we call heritage areas, the older areas of town, but also the areas that to a great degree give our city, our capital, its place identity. And we have, lost a lot of it over the years. And what little we have left, well, what do we want to do with it? And then when we start to think, do we want more of it? Do we want to grow it out more? And do we want that to become the template of what we do, either in or within or around or beyond the heart of our community? So, as you may know, the NCC has a lot of plans. We have a 50-year plan called the Plan for Canada's Capital. And under that plan, there's a series of sector plans. And one of the more important ones is the Core Area Plan, which is the core of the capital. It's the greater downtown core on both sides of the Ottawa River, Ottawa and Gatineau. So it expands the two provinces. And I had my team produce this map, which is kind of a superimposition of a figure ground between 1948 and 2022. And if you zoom in on this map, you can see a lot of things. The darker is 2022 and the lighter color is 1948. And a lot of things pop up when you look at a map like this, and you can spend, a long time just geeking out of it. But you can see a lot of streets that have disappeared, a lot of buildings that have disappeared, a lot of footprints that got enormously bigger and swallowed up what used to be a lot of smaller footprints of buildings. You could see a lot of road infrastructure that has sort of rolled over what used to be city blocks. You can even see in some places, buildings very close to the water, almost on the water. You can see a number of things that are phantom memories, I guess, just to go back to what Dr. Buras was alluding to. And, through a planner's eyes, there's four things that are happening here. The challenges or the changes that took place. The scale of blocks and buildings is different. The segregation of uses is different. The functional segregation of streets and roads is different. I have a slide. And then that leads to a segregation of districts. And just to illustrate, this is what we know as Confederation Square. And what you see in the lighter color is the old streets and blocks and buildings that used to exist before Confederation Square was done. And Confederation Square, which was done between 1937 and 1939, involved clearing out 5 city blocks of buildings and streets, widening Wellington Street, widening Elgin Street, basically detouring Spark Street, and basically creating this very large area where the War Memorial now sits, but has sort of become an urban void in some ways as well. Not that it's not beautiful, but the relationship that used to exist between Rideau and Spark Street has completely changed. It used to be almost, like half a block across the canal and boom, you're into city again. And now it's a much larger distance. We'll see that the accumulation of these added up to a lot of isolation of districts. So if you look at an air photo of 1928 of this area and an air photo of it now, you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is another example. This used to be near Green Island, so Sussex going towards New Edinburgh. And these were blocks of Lower Town that used to reach up to Sussex. And this is it now. So Lower Town ends much earlier. And then you have the entry to the McDonald and Cartier Bridge. And then you have the big bunker, the Lester and Pearson building, which is Foreign Affairs. But that's completely separated now from what used to be Lower Town. So that leads to this discussion, use segregation. So this was a government building built in 1921 called the Jackson Building. It's still there. It's the same building. It's been clad differently after the 1950s. And you can see it in the plan. It's the highlighted building in with the other building footprints of Centertown. So that was a government building as they were building them in 1921. This is a government building as they were building them in 1974. So you can see that it's not part of an urban fabric anymore. It's a footprint by itself on a large parcel separated by, a lot of open space, residual space, unprogrammed space, unpurposed space. So detached from the rest of the city or detached from the urban fabric and on a very different scale. And here's another example. Wellington Street after the Supreme Court just kind of peters out and it turns into the Portage Bridge. But back in 1938, it was a continuous traditional main street with brick buildings and stores. And that's the figure ground map of it, highlighted in yellow. And that's this area now. So if we were to ask anybody, well, you know what's there? Well, nothing much comes to mind. It's just a road that turns the corner and leads you to the bridge. But there used to be a whole bunch of buildings and a place and blocks that, took you from one block to the next as you walked. So this is one of the things that we're trying to address as a challenge. With that came how streets and roads are segregated. So pre-1940, no traffic engineering. There was a hierarchy of boulevards, avenues, streets, and lanes. There was an emphasis on looks. When you said you lived in an avenue, it meant something better than a street. And congestion was an unfortunate effect, but it was not a driver of major urban surgery. It's just a sign that people wanted to go there. Post 1960s, traffic engineering is much more of an engineering philosophy. So it's a level of service for traffic. And that's the main driver of design. And there is a suburban hierarchy of freeway, arterial, collector, local that's imported and imprinted into downtowns. And that has a very profound effect. So just around the corner here, Lisgar and O'Connor, you have the street as it looked in 1938 and the street as it looks now. And even with the bike lanes, you can see the changes in how wide the right of way is, and obviously the absence of trees. And even if you look at a map in 1909 and versus 2020, the streets that are highlighted are not the same. The streets that were highlighted in 1909 were the shopping streets and where the streetcars were. In 2020, it's part of that highway arterial kind of network. And those are the streets that are highlighted. So even the geography is conveyed in maps is not the same anymore. So you add all this up and it gives you that segregation of districts at a coarse grain. So this is our downtown. And when we look at this from the planning office of the National Capital Commission, we realize the federal government has consolidated a whole bunch of lands, and it's the federal realm or the crown realm, but it's all consolidated and it's all its own thing. And then you have, districts of city that are separated by these things. And so what we're interested in is how we can start to blend those back together. Where can we intervene to sort of weave the city fabric back together? And this is where we get into architecture, because as Nir said, well, a city is a lot, the collection of its buildings and what you're looking at. And we have this document in Canada called the Standards and Guidelines for the Conservation of Historic Places in Canada. And there's one particular thing that goes with that, and Nir alluded to it, is that a lot of the architecture schools are still very focused on functionalism and modernism. And the profession in Canada really is still very partial to modernism. Buildings should be of their time, form follows function, and that's the philosophy. And the difficulty, the struggle we've been having is that the standards and guidelines are an excellent document, but some parts of it are written in a way that really skews towards modernism if you interpret them a certain way. And this is especially the case for what we call Standard 11. Standard 11 talks about conserving the heritage value and character defining elements when creating any new additions to an historic place or any related new construction. And it says, make the new work physically and visually compatible with, subordinate to, and distinguishable from the historic place. So what do we do with this? Well, helpfully, there are definitions for heritage value and character defining elements, but frustratingly, there is no rationale for or explanation as to why things have to be subordinate to or distinguishable from. And that's the struggle. So when we look at the definition of heritage value, what I highlighted there can be taken to mean that we can do what Nir is telling us to do. Do new traditional buildings, aesthetic, historic, materials, forms, spatial configurations. Same for character defining elements, materials, forms, spatial configurations, which must be retained. So that's clear. But then we've got the subordinate to and distinguishable from, which sometimes are the things that are cherry picked in order to land at a product that is completely alien from and different or contrasting to the place you're building in. So you could be meeting the strict word of one of the recommended directions and completely avoiding meeting the intent, the true intent. So is it true that you can't build new buildings in classical styles? Well, here's a few more examples of eye candy because I just like to show these. 2004 addition to the Baltimore Hippodrome. Condos in New York City, 2015. Residence in Chicago, 2011. Opera House in Nashville, 2003. Dresden, I mean, we've just talked about this. The story of Dresden, by the way, is remarkable. They got completely bombed out during World War II, and for decades, it was ruins. And then they started to ask themselves how to rebuild, and there were two very competing visions, and they decided to go with what you see today, which is a reconstruction based on historic photographs of what used to be there. And it's wonderful, and it was very controversial. but that was their choice, and this is what they're doing. Jerusalem, the Mamilla Mall, 2 brand new buildings, 2015 in London, infill sites. These are like not even 10 years old. Four Seasons Hotel, Baku. New hotel in Bilbao, Spain. New hotel in Barcelona. New hotel in Edinburgh, Radisson. In addition to the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City from the 1990s. So while researching this, I landed on work done by the city of Philadelphia, which has a lot of large and well-preserved 18th century neighborhoods, 19th century neighborhoods. And they had this report where they talk about 4 valid approaches to additions or new constructions in historic districts. And I feel that that's a piece of discussion that we've been missing all along. But before you start to talk about how you should do a building or an addition, maybe the first question should be, well, where should it be on the scale of integration versus contrast? And it is a sliding scale from full contrast to full integration. And there's degrees in between. So examples from Ottawa. Intentional opposition, Bank of Canada. You have the traditional building from the 1930s and the Arthur Erickson additions from the 1970s. You have the Museum of Nature. So the Victoria Memorial Museum from the 1910s and the Lantern from 100 years afterwards. Then you have abstract reference. This is the building that we saw yesterday by Mark Brandt, Trace Architectures, the Sir John A. Macdonald building, in addition to the Bank of Montreal building on Wellington Street. So abstract reference to the original. Another one, the 700 Sussex, abstract reference, 2003. And then you get a little closer to integration. This is invention within a same style or related style. This is the Montmartre condominiums from 2007. Lord Elgin Hotel with its 2 addition wings. And then you get into literal replication, which is buildings like this, which you wouldn't know. This building is from the 1990s. There was an original there before, it burnt, and the decision was we're going to rebuild exactly the way it was. The Kaplan building, which was taken down and reconstructed as part of a development that now has a tower in behind. So that's literal replication. Or just something like the wheelchair ramp on the Royal Canadian Mint, which was done with exactly the same stone and exactly the same, language. So that's full integration. So where on the spectrum should a building land? And what does it mean to be of its time? So, there's, again, we talked about fractality, and we also talk about this. A building should be of its time. What does that mean, really? The building on the left, you guys probably know it. It's on Rideau Street. It's the Bell Exchange building. It's of its time. It's 80s. Is it fractal? Is it beautiful? Then you have a building right next door. It's the Boss retail building in Barcelona. It is of its time, but it's part of an urban fabric and it's part of the street face. And it is clearly of its time, but it's trying to connect with what's around it. And then of its time, you have some of the examples from Berlin that Dr. Buras showed. That's the picture on the left. Brand new buildings, which you can see are not 100 years old. It's of its time. It's a building that is of today. It's shiny, but it's in a style that is congruent with the environment. And of its time, I just came back to this building because, well, of its time means that little year up on the top, 1993. That's the thing that says that it's of its time. What does it mean to be of its time? Well, it's not necessarily a style. It's an energy efficient building. It's a net zero building. It can be fully 5G. It's got electric chargers for EVs. It's got bike parking. It's got modern plumbing, electric systems. It's seismic resistant. There's a lot of ways that a building can be of its time. But in my mind, it has nothing to do with the style of that building or the look of that building. Those are deliberate choices that we get to make. So when to use? Well, when to use intentional opposition in any place where you prioritize differentiation. And abstract reference is when you want to balance differentiation and compatibility, but tilt more toward contrast. On the other side of the scale, when to use invention within style? Well, when you want to balance differentiation and contrast, but tilt toward compatibility. And when do you want to do literal replication or full integration? When you prioritize continuity over contrast. So are these perhaps the parameters of guidelines or policies or frameworks or approaches through which we would go through, deciding how and what to build? So this is a topic that we want to talk about at the NCC as part of the core area sector plan. We want to see if there's appetite for a framework on architectural expression. Again, of all Canadian cities, we, the nation's capital, should be the one and the first tackling this. And we firmly believe that it's something that people are interested in and that we hear quite a bit about, and that we honestly want to challenge ourselves in addressing. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Buras and Alain. You've both given us a lot to talk about the big picture of the classic and the other terms you used. And Alain, the drilling down to the Ottawa context and what the NCC is doing, all fascinating. We do have some time for questions, and I see the hands already shooting up. So I'm going to, do we have a mic, Jen, to pass around? Oh, there it is. There's a gentleman at the back here. He was waving his arm, and then Sandy, you're number 2. It's right there.
First, is it on? I'm sorry, you can hear me. Thank you. Thank you both for your presentation. When I got the email that this is going to go on, I was quite excited. I'll tell you why. My name's David Perry. I run a firm in town called Perry Martell International. We are an executive search firm. We specialize in construction and real estate, and we've been all over the world helping build cities on a project by project basis. I was standing in Scotia Square, Scotia Tower, with Mr. Campo in 1985. That's how old I am. And I'm looking out the window, and he's trying to decide whether or not he's going to build a building. And if he decides to build it, and he did, it would have been the first building south of the Gardiner. So when we're looking at this out the window, there's nothing south of the Gardiner. The water, that's it, and the train lands, and it's for naught. You can't do that today because the pigeons can't land anywhere south of the Gardiner. So that's something I'm concerned about with Ottawa. Here are 2 more things. A, the federal government doesn't have any more money to sponsor any great architecture buildings. Fix stuff, perhaps. The architects that are coming out of school now, they went into school excited because that's what architecture does with people. It excites them, and they come out as code jockeys. They really do, and not happy. So here's my question for the 2 of you, because Mr. Buras, I have researched your stuff and read a lot of stuff in the last 2 weeks, and Mr. Miguelez, I've read everything that you produced and everything that you put up on LinkedIn. So here's my question. It's a simple one. How can architects balance aesthetic beauty with authentic, sustainable design within a holistic system approach, ensuring that both the built environment and the natural ecosystem are considered, while also delivering a strong ROI and meeting the profit expectations of private investors? I have not seen that question answered by anybody anywhere in the world.
It's a really good question. And the developers I've been working with are realizing that buildings are not financial instruments. They have become financial instruments, but buildings are the building blocks, excuse the semi-pun, of our cities, of our built environment. They're much more than some dude's financial instrument. And the vested interests that run projects really operate from fear of not making enough money or losing what they have and so on and so forth. So it's up to the community more so than the developers to figure out what the community wants for itself, assuming there is a community. If we're all individuals and sort of disconnected from each other and there really is no community, then I suppose forget about it and just figure out the ROI with the cheapest stuff that the code jockeys can cobble together. But if you really are, I suppose, a player, a real human, trying to do something a little more than just, and most people, they take care of their families very well, and they still try to do a lot more than that with their communities, people I work with and I know. So the answer is we have to step back from the promises of cheap but nice. That never worked. We have to step away from considering buildings financial instruments alone and get back to community building and city reconstruction.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack on the question and say two things. One, we showed images of real buildings that were built by real developers, and they wouldn't be there if they weren't making money. So there is a business case for buildings that add value. And therefore, the question is a building that looks better giving you more? Is there a bump up in the return if you do a building that looks better and therefore that is going to last longer and retain its value longer? I think that's one answer. The other is I've been following with a lot of interest what's happening in the UK because they're about 4 or 5 years ahead of us dealing with the housing crisis. Obviously, in London, it's been going on for much longer than here in Canada. And in the UK, they've set up something called the Office for Place. And the Office for Place is the office that is charged with delivering the housing agenda in the UK. And they also have very ambitious targets of millions of units that they need to deliver very quickly. And they've gotten themselves naturally through the process that we're now starting in Canada to the conclusion that you can't have housing without beauty and without real neighborhoods and without communities that people get to own and love. And they've incorporated that as a way of de-risking development because in the UK, perhaps even more so than here in Canada, the NIMBY opposition is real, it's painful, and it's costly. And if there's a code, a design code that everybody plays by that generates the buy-in that you need in order to deliver as many thousands of doors as you need to deliver in a country like the UK, well, they've come to the conclusion that it's probably in everybody's benefit to do that, get as a minimum level of quality and get the buy-in that you need structurally to de-risk what you're doing from a development side. I think that's a logical place for us to land here in Canada once we start to parse down what we're trying to do here with the housing agenda. And when I look at the material that they're doing in the UK out of the Office for Place, I'm amazed. It makes me salivate, and it gives me hope that this is the logical progression of what we're trying to do here.
He speaks much better than I do. But two things. Number one, any building over 40,000 square feet, if you're doing a reasonably good building, is going to cost the same regardless of style. Number two, there is a bump up, a notable bump up. It's in the 10-15% range for good looking stuff. And when I say good looking, I mean traditional and authentic traditional, not sort of whatever, not because the authentic traditional does have those values I was talking about earlier on, the aesthetic values. So yes, the people who are really smart are doing this kind of stuff, and everybody else is just chasing the dollar. Now you go first.
Sandy, your question, please. And then Carolyn, if you have any online ones, we'll do one next, okay?
Thanks very much. Great presentations and lots to think about from both of you. Dr. Buras, one thing, I mean, there's so much that you did cover, but there's one thing that I didn't really hear you cover. And you were just saying about the importance of authenticity. You didn't mention materials at all. And I really wonder, one of the things that really disappoints me with a lot of our new classical buildings is the use of synthetic materials that copy or attempt to copy the original materials in the classical architecture. It's really sad because Alain, you had mentioned about these buildings will last a long time, but they won't, not with synthetic materials. The thing about modern no maintenance materials is they can't be maintained. They have to be thrown out. Windows will last 20 years and then they go to a landfill site. Traditional classical buildings had windows that lasted hundreds of years. Individually glazed wood mullions. So we're not doing that anymore. We're not using carved stone. We're using foam blocks to look like stone. So I would like to hear a comment about that. If you're talking about traditional and authentic, what about the materials?
If you're doing a reasonable building, you're going to use real materials. And if you're trying to not, you won't. So you don't really have genuine traditional buildings, well built, that use all kinds of strange materials. Basically, plastic is not a building material, and you want to minimize the amount of metal and glass you see in a facade. Want to surface the building. The best possible surface humans ever developed was actually glazed terracotta. So that technology it's bound to come back because it is so long-term cost effective. The whole idea of replacement is simply, it's old. It's something that we grew up with, but you know, the way we're working already, our clients aren't thinking about that at all. They're thinking long-term, 100-year building, 200-year building. So yeah, it's got to be real materials. What's the option?
I'm not going to try an answer because I'm not versed enough, but I think that when you look at typical cladding in Ottawa, it's been brick. I know that brick has been an issue. It's been hard to get brick in Ottawa, and I think that's a real shame. It doesn't have to be the super high noble cut stone necessarily. Good material can be accent. And things like brick are just as genuine and authentic to Ottawa. And we know it from some of the buildings that you're in. I think I subscribe to what Nir is saying.
Thank you for the question, Sandy. Carolyn, I think we have a question from one of our online video viewers. Go ahead, please. There it is.
Check.
The question is short and simple. In your opinion, does scale or human size factor into this conversation?
Yes. Very much. Short answer, yes, very much. What I was showing earlier about scale of blocks, scale of buildings, does make a huge difference in how people read a street and read a district and read their environment. And the texture of, you know, a multiplicity of facades and a multiplicity of what looks like different buildings and looks like different owners and looks like different interests, and the comings and goings of generations at a small scale on a block and on a street and in a district is really what gives you the texture of an area. And the passage of time, you know, we're a young city, 200 years old, right? So we have 200 years of generations passing through. If you double that at 400, Montreal's got 400 years. And then you get to cities that have 1,000 years. That passage of time, meaning generations coming into the same space and reinterpreting the same space their own way, And that layering, that urban sedimentation that happens, that's the magic of places that are interesting. So I think very much it does matter.
I think everything ever built traditionally was based on pleasing the human. I think that is human scale. Some things are small, some things are medium, and some things are large. The really important stuff has to be larger. Really important stuff has to be prettier than the more mundane stuff. So obviously, scale and people, we're doing it for others. We're not doing it for ourselves. Certainly not to be geniuses and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you for the question. Great question.
Yes, go ahead right there in the center. Can we get a mic in the center? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Ursula. There we go. Yeah, I may be coming from this as someone who quite regularly gets messages sent to me of, I saw this ugly building and I thought of you. Because I've been giving walking tours on brutalist architecture for the last decade. And through that kind of learning and making people connect with these buildings that they think of as ugly buildings, and learning that they have positive memories in those spaces, and that connection between space and memory, and how much of that is a natural predisposition to the style, and how much is an associated one that we learn through positive memories that associate with the space, and then that style of architecture can become a space that reminds us, and it's that connection there. So maybe then also thinking how beautiful spaces, or what we might think of as beautiful in this kind of classical sense, are also spaces of negative memories for the trauma associated to colonization, and these as representative of the colonizing style. So that kind of tension between whether it's the beauty that evokes or it's the memory that makes us think of something as beautiful, and how we can kind of leave space for both of those.
Those are really, really nice thoughts. And they really do show this kind of romantic salad of ideas that has been filling the conversation. Everybody can say and do and think and feel whatever they want. We can't tell anybody what to think or feel. And the idea that a certain individual decides that for some intellectual reason something is thumbs up or something is thumbs down, it happens all the time. It can happen about anything. We don't care about that content. We care about your personal, measurable brain, body, mind-body experience. That mind-body experience comes in the first 40 milliseconds of you seeing anything. And then the rest is discourse. And you need a little person next to the building to explain it. I was trained in brutalism. That's how I started my career. And I actually designed the most ugly building I possibly could imagine in order to pass the California licensing exam. And I passed the first time. So there are fashions. There are ways of thinking. I think all of them are perfectly fine, just like we have different types of music. Everybody likes something else. I don't see anything wrong with that. So thank you for the comment. And I would say, let's all continue thinking about it.
What I would offer is, as is often heard, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So I have no quarrel with people's individual taste, and there is a body of aficionados for brutalism, and they have their reasons for it, and I don't dispute it. It's what they find beautiful, and that's fine. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I, in my eye, behold that I find other things beautiful, and I don't want anybody to quarrel with me about that. I don't, I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that classical or traditional architecture necessarily is associated, like it's the only thing to be associated with colonialism. I mean, I don't presume to speak for indigenous people. I'm not one of them, but I wouldn't be surprised if they found modern buildings to just be as colonial. There's nothing indigenous about modernist buildings either. And there may be very bad memories associated with indigenous experience in modernist buildings too. So I think for me, that's a non-issue. I think it's more an issue of what do we want? What do we want more of? And personally, in my eye, I behold that, yeah, there are a few brutalist buildings that are emblematic of a certain era, and they should be kept and they should be representative of that era. In the back of my mind, I also tell myself it's a good thing the whole city's not like that, because I don't think we'd have much of a city. But those few pieces are there as emblems of their era, and that's what I behold in my eye, and that's my understanding according to my aesthetic interpretation. And I'm entitled to it, just like you're entitled to yours. So then the discussion becomes something else, and it becomes, well, broadly, what are we doing with intention and with symbolism and with the places and their meaning, and what do we want to add, or how do we want to add to them? That's a much broader discussion.
I have a question back here.
Thank you for those. Yeah, Carolyn, we'll take that, and then David Jeans will go next.
This question has come in from one of our online participants, and it's for you, Alain. How is the NCC planning to incorporate Indigenous design and style?
I think there's a lot of ways that we've been actually working with. We have very good partnerships with the Algonquin nations, Kitigan Zibi and Pikwakanagan, especially. We're about to reopen the former Nepean Point, now called Kiweki Point, the name of which and the placemaking of which was determined on the basis of Indigenous experiences. And I'll invite everybody to go and see it, and it's stunning. There's a lot of different ways that we can express Indigenous presence, culture, and history. And again, nowhere else than in the nation's capital should you be able to see and feel and experience the presence of Indigenous nations in the nation's capital. We are their nation's capital too. Now, there's placemaking, there's landscape architecture, and the question of architecture of buildings is one that I find personally also very interesting. We're one of the first cities in the world that has a building, the History Museum on the Gatineau side, that was deliberately designed with the intent of having an Indigenous expression to the shape of the building. The Wabeno Center in Vanier on Montreal Road follows the same kind of logic. And I think there's a lot to be explored there. And I think it's an exciting perspective, again, for us as a city and the capital city of the nation to go down that path.
David. And I think we'll make this, we got one more question, and then that'll be the end, because we're getting to the end of our time. Thank you.
Actually, on a related topic to what Alain has just mentioned, Dr. Buras, you mentioned the Aboriginal presence on the mall in Washington as your feeling that perhaps it wasn't really done in an appropriate way. And I'm wondering, did you mean the Museum of the American Indian? Because that's a very special place for us. The concept came from Douglas Cardinal, and the History Museum here in Gatineau and the Wabeno First Nations Center by him are repeating that kind of undulating, curving architecture. By contrast, we have handed over to the First Nations the Cass Gilbert designed classical former US Embassy to be the Aboriginal center opposite Parliament Hill. And I'm just saying, would you really consider that, using a classical reference, as being more appropriate than the curving architecture of Douglas Cardinal?
The curving the beautiful curving architecture of Douglas Cardinal is basically German expressionism. The Cass Gilbert building is a Western, sort of a general Western edifice built with some capacity, but it lends itself in a classical way to ornamentation and detailing. Bring in some people to recarve some of the panels, create new parts to it in a truly crafted way. Indian folks who actually know how to deal with stone and shapes of animals and shapes of their symbols, and make that building yours. The curved shapes they were taught in architecture school in the 70s when I was a student, and I did at least one project like that. They're very nice, but they don't belong to anybody or anything. They don't really represent anything other than themselves, kind of. They're self-referential. And this leads to a really serious question. In general, in architecture, the difference between architecture and vernacular. I'm not going to go down that path at all, but it is something that consumes many architects. So how to express these things exactly? I would submit to you that when the Muslims came out of Arabia and started building mosques for themselves, they had the same problem because they were nomads. They never built anything or very little. How are they going to express themselves? So the question has been brought up many, many times. And I think it takes a while to figure it out. So we have examples. Some of them are really terrific and very talented work done by Mr. Cardinal and others. And there might be other approaches that might be even more effusive of the values and the heritage and so on. I have no idea, but I think that the options should be left way open and not just German expressionism.
All right. Thank you for that. And our last question, Phil, you had a question.
We're thinking about talking about the buildings and attracting the buildings have to be attractive, obviously, the beauty as you talked about. But the reason that people want to go to the buildings, I think, private market, for obvious reasons. But it used to be a place that people wanted to go. Then the urban sprawl allowed the creation of the so-called 15-minute neighborhoods. So people don't have an attraction to go downtown to look at those buildings. There's got to be something in the building or something nearby the building that people want to go. And I think that's maybe part of the problem. So I was just recently in Croatia, and I'll just be quick about this. Dubrovnik, a walled city. People had to go into the city when it wasn't when it was at war. When it wasn't at war, they went out, they farmed, and they did everything else. But there was a reason that they had to come back. So those buildings were built other than for tax collection, for religion, for all sorts of things, and markets. But people went to the market. Now people don't go. So is there something relative to bigger cities like this that would help attract? And I said, talking about getting more, obviously, residential or bigger residential capacity. Is there a way of designing around that to create an atmosphere where you have commerce, you have desire?
It's like this, right? People got it. It's really a question.
No, I think you raise a good point, and I think it's something that urban planners have been tackling at least for the past 25 years. 2,500 years in, but more so, I guess, in response to what's happened with cities in the past, let's say 75 years or so. And I think it goes back, it starts with, every place should be its own place, and it should cater to the residents of its own place first. And that's what brings interest. If a place is dynamic because its own residents are there doing a lot of things and it's unique and it develops its own flavor. And that really was the Byward Market. It was a unique place, but it had a life of its own. It had its own parishes and its synagogues and its stores and its schools, and it was a world into its own. And it became popular because as the city, expanded outward, it was the heart of town, the old part of town, and the place where most people had that place memory of the founding of the place. And I think it holds that special role in our entire collective memory. So I think there's something special about the Byward Market, but in general, I would say that any neighborhood has to exist for its neighbors first. And once it's interesting in its own right as a place, it'll attract interest from beyond.
Yeah. Markets are one of my favorite kind of place that humans create for each other. I was involved in Eastern Market in Washington, D.C. It's 5 blocks, 7 blocks from the U.S. Capitol in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And it's still going today, even though in 1935, the very first Safeway was built right across the street from it. And then it burnt down about 10 or 15 years ago. It's been rebuilt. I'm in touch, even though I moved to Maine, I'm in touch weekly with people from it. It's a real community kind of a thing. And I think that I really hold market communities super high. I think that the folks who actually come together to make a market are some of the most fascinating, amazing guys, tomato guys, the cucumber guys, the pickle people, the fruit guys. They're all, their perspective on the world is something that we all want to share, get to know, and you do by going to the market. You talk to these people and everything else. You do need a community that's going to go shopping there. How you get there exactly, technically, specifically, I'm not exactly sure, but I have a sneaky suspicion that Eastern Market went through downs and ups like you're experiencing maybe, or Byward Market is experiencing, and maybe talk with some of the people about how to overcome. The difference is that within a 10-block radius of Eastern Market, you still have people living in homes, in townhouses, and 2- and 3-story townhouses. That's the neighborhood. So maybe that whole neighborhood has to be reconfigured with its institutions like the market and so on and so forth. If I may, I've been really thinking about this whole business of churches that are abandoned and sold off and so on and so forth. Community is a really, really significant thing. If you have or you belong to a community, hold on to it and nurture it. That's all I can tell you. It's really, really, really important. Even if you hate the other guys, or even if they piss you off or something, it's really a valuable thing. And communities need community spaces. So the market is one of those community spaces. You remember the old post offices? They were a community space. And of course, churches and schools and all that kind of stuff. We don't take the 5 or 10 or 15-year time scale. We actually think about planning as a multi-generational thing. We take the 100-year perspective on everything, at least 4 generations, so that you have a chance both to start moving towards fixing something and then correcting on the way. And I think that the answer is a little more richer and complex than just fixing a market somehow to make it more attractive. But I am sure that it is possible to do. And then one of the things you want to bring in is all this retailing and all these experts on how to set stuff up and sell it and all that jazz, and then use the internet to get the word around. There are a lot of tools, but it has to be done in a concerted way with a focus and with a real good message. I have no idea what that might be, but it's something that I think is of value, and it would be of value, and that you ought to have. You probably do have, I don't know, at least five markets, sort of farmer markets, maybe more, in the community that are viable and people go to, and so on and so forth. I think those are hugely important in the community. They've got to be supported really by the governing institutions, I believe.
Thank you, Dr. Buras and Alain, for taking these questions, and thank you to the audience for being here this evening, both online and in person. I'd now like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, and I have a small token of thanks for Alain, as it's smaller. There you go. Alain is local, and we're very fond of him at Heritage Ottawa, and he's a great supporter of Heritage Ottawa, in addition to being having the NCC support us. So we're very grateful. And this did start as a lecture with just Alain, and it's thanks to him that we have had Dr. Buras. So doubly thank you for that. And I don't usually give away what's in people's parcels, but I am going to this time, because Ottawa is a unique spot. And we have town and crown issues, which were mentioned earlier. But we also have very fancy buildings, and we have simpler buildings that are really forming a function. So this is a book that talks about the house that houses the King's representative in Ottawa. And it's a 21st century perspective on a 19th century building. So that's book number one. You're welcome. And this is book number two, which is a contrast in that it talks about the buildings on our local farm, which is the Central Experimental Farm. So completely different. Both are landscapes, have beautiful landscapes, but different contrasts and different buildings. Yeah, and finally, I really don't tell people what's in their cards, but this is a thank you card, and it's from my collection of thank you cards. I am delighted to share it with you. And it comes from a box of photographs that were from 1937. And in fact, the box of these cards was created by Alain. And this picture is a 1937 view of Wellington Street. And right in the center is the American legation as it was at the time, with the American flag above. So there you are. So thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Oh, sorry, I'll move away.
Excuse me, Luann, could I trouble you to bring a book up here, please? That's fine. I did want to say thank you to Heritage Ottawa and to Catherine. This has really been a very moving talk for me. I hope you weren't all bored, but I was really moved. And the questions really fired me up. And I wanted to thank you for hosting me so beautifully. Thank you. Yeah. You have a copy of the book? Yeah. Okay. So thank you all very, very much and have a wonderful night.